whiskey breath and cherry lipstick. Welcome to the world of country. Romance. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The dust of Redemption Gulch was a fine, reddish powder that settled on everything. A constant reminder that the untamed wilderness was merely holding its breath at the town's edges. It clung to the unpainted clapboard of the buildings, filled the deep ruts in the single main street, and coated the throats of weary travelers who rode in seeking either fortune or oblivion. It was into this gritty, sun-scorched amphitheater that arrived, not on a tired horse or in a rattling stagecoach, but on her own 2 feet, carrying a single, well-worn carpet bag that seemed to hold the entirety of her past. She moved with a purpose that belied the desolate landscape, her gaze sweeping over the town not with the uncertainty of a newcomer, but with the sharp, assessing focus of a predator surveying its hunting grounds. Her curly brown hair was pulled back, a few defiant tendrils escaping to frame a face that was both beautiful and severe, dominated by piercing green eyes and lips painted a startling, defiant shade of cherry red. That splash of color was a declaration, a flower blooming in the desert, and it was the first thing anyone truly noticed about her. Her destination was the largest and loudest building in town, the Last Chance Saloon, a place where dreams were either drowned in cheap whiskey or loudly proclaimed over the discordant notes of a perpetually out-of-tune piano. She pushed through the swinging doors, the sudden gloom and the thick smell of stale beer, sweat, and sawdust a stark contrast to the glaring sun outside. The saloon's proprietor, a barrel-chested man named Gus with a suspicious squint and forearms like cured hams, watched her approach the bar. He was prepared to send her packing, assuming she was another desperate woman looking for the kind of work he didn't advertise, but spoke before he could, her voice clear and steady. She wasn't looking for a handout or pity. She was looking for a job, specifically as a singer. Gus almost laughed, gesturing to the sad, slumped figure at the piano, but was undeterred, insisting he let her sing one song, just one, promising that it would be more than worth his time. Intrigued by her audacity, and perhaps by the unnerving intensity in her green eyes, he gruffly agreed, and what followed silenced the rowdy establishment. Her voice was not merely pleasant. It was a captivating instrument, filled with a sorrowful, haunting quality that spoke of loss and resilience, a sound that resonated with the hard-bitten souls who populated the room, each man nursing his own private griefs and failures. She sang of lost love and long roads, and by the time the final note faded, the silence was thick with unspoken emotion. Gus, a man not known for sentiment, merely grunted and offered her the job, a room upstairs, and a wage that was surprisingly fair, a testament to the undeniable power she had just unleashed. From a shadowed table in the corner, Oliver watched the entire spectacle unfold. His chair leaned back against the wall and a half-empty glass of whiskey sitting untouched before him. At 34, he was a man carved from the land he worked, his medium-length dusty blonde hair lightened by the sun and his face weathered by the wind and hard labor. He rarely came into town and even more rarely entered the saloon, preferring the quiet solitude of his ranch and the company of his own thoughts, but a need for supplies had drawn him in, and a strange premonition had kept him there. He observed performance with the same keen, patient eye he used to watch for a coming storm or a predator stalking his herd. He was, like every other man in the room, struck by her raw, arresting beauty and the soul-stirring quality of her voice, the way her cherry-red lips formed words that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Yet, his instincts, honed by years of self-reliance in a landscape that was as unforgiving as it was beautiful, detected a discordant note beneath the melody. He saw that while her song was for the room, her eyes were not. They were constantly, subtly, drifting toward the far corner, where the town's unofficial king, Jade Blackwood, held court, his corpulent frame overflowing his reinforced chair as he laughed loudly with his sycophants. Oliver knew Blackwood for the venomous snake he was, a man who had built an empire on greed and intimidation, and he saw in guarded glances a flicker of something cold and dangerous, a focused hatred that she concealed behind a veneer of artistic melancholy. This woman was not just a singer. She was a storm gathering on the horizon, and Oliver felt a deep, instinctual certainty that she was about to break over Redemption Gulch. A few nights later, that storm showed its first flash of lightning. Oliver was concluding a deal for lumber when the familiar sounds of trouble spilled from the saloon. He wasn't a man who went looking for fights, but he felt an undeniable pull, a need to see what was unfolding. Inside, one of Blackwood's ranch hands, a hulking brute thick with whiskey and entitlement, had cornered by the piano. He had his hand clamped on her arm, his leering face far too close to hers, demanding a private performance. Stood her ground, her body rigid, her expression a mask of cool contempt, but a tremor of fear was visible in the tight line of her jaw. Before Gus could heave his considerable bulk over the bar, Oliver was already moving, not with the explosive haste of a brawler, but with the calm, deliberate economy of a man who understands leverage and intent. He didn't throw a punch or even raise his voice. He simply placed himself between the drunken lout and his presence an immovable object. "The lady's busy," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the man's drunken haze. The ranch hand, momentarily confused by this quiet intervention, blustered and postured, but found himself staring into a pair of ice-blue eyes that held no fear and offered no quarter. He saw a man who was not impressed by Blackwood's brand and who looked fully prepared to end the confrontation in a much more permanent and painful way. Defeated by that silent promise of violence, the man grumbled a curse and staggered away. Oliver then turned his gaze to a silent question passing between them in the charged air. He smelled the faint, clean scent of leather and the sharp tang of whiskey on his own clothes. But what he would remember long after he left was the sweet, lingering scent of cherries that seemed to emanate from her, a fragrant ghost that followed him out into the cool night air. In the weeks that followed, a peculiar string of bad luck began to dog Jade Blackwood's sprawling operation, a series of incidents that were too small to be considered a direct threat, but too consistent to be mere coincidence. Oliver heard the whispers around town and at the general store, piecing together the narrative of Blackwood's misfortunes with a growing sense of understanding. A crucial section of fence bordering the north pasture was expertly cut, not torn down, allowing 100 head of prime cattle to wander into the rocky, inaccessible canyons, requiring a week-long, costly roundup. A shipment of winter feed, left on a rail siding, was found to be mysteriously contaminated with a fast-acting mold, rendering it useless and forcing Blackwood to pay an exorbitant price for an emergency replacement. A vital well on his southern range was fouled, not poisoned, but filled with enough foul-smelling swamp muck to make it unusable for weeks. To most, it was just a run of misfortune, but to Oliver, a man who understood the rhythms and vulnerabilities of a ranching empire, these events were like a carefully composed piece of music. They were intelligent, precise strikes designed not to destroy, but to disrupt, to bleed resources, and to chip away at the foundation of Blackwood's power. It was the work of someone who knew exactly where to apply pressure to cause the maximum amount of irritation and financial strain, and his thoughts kept returning to the singer at the Last Chance Saloon with the watchful, calculating eyes. His certainty crystallized on a moonless, starless night, the kind that offered perfect cover for clandestine activities. An inexplicable urge had led Oliver to ride the perimeter of his own property, his gaze drawn toward the distant, dark mass of Blackwood's ranch. From a high, pine-covered ridge, he saw a lone figure, silhouetted for a moment against the slightly less black sky. Though he couldn't be certain from that distance, his gut told him it was. He tethered his horse and watched, his patience a familiar companion. He waited for nearly 2 hours, the silence broken only by the sigh of the wind through the pines. Then, in the distance, a small, bright flower of orange bloomed in the darkness near Blackwood's stables, a well-placed haystack set ablaze. It wasn't a fire meant to burn down the barn, but one placed perfectly to create panic. The terrified, high-pitched whinnies of horses echoed across the valley, followed by the splintering crash of wood as the stampede began, Blackwood's prized quarter horses scattering in every direction into the night. It was a masterfully executed piece of chaos. Knowing she would have to return to town, Oliver chose a narrow, shadowed section of the path and waited. He didn't have to wait long. She moved through the darkness with a swift, silent grace that confirmed his suspicions. He stepped out from behind a thicket of manzanita, his form a solid shadow against the gloom. "That's quite a fire," he said, his voice even and devoid of accusation, a simple statement of fact that carried the weight of an indictment. Froze, her hand flying to her chest, but she made no sound. Oliver took a slow step closer, the scent of wood smoke clinging to her clothes. "You seem to find yourself close by whenever trouble comes for Jade Blackwood," he continued, his tone dangerously soft. "What are you really doing in Redemption Gulch?" The darkness on the path was absolute, a thick, velvety cloak that swallowed all light and sound, yet Oliver's presence was as solid and undeniable as a mountain. Froze, her heart hammering against her ribs not just from the shock of his appearance, but from the chilling finality in his voice. In that single, terrifying moment, her carefully constructed world of secrets and vengeance threatened to shatter completely. She could see nothing of his expression in the gloom, only the imposing silhouette of a man who had clearly unraveled her entire purpose. A desperate lie formed on her lips, a flimsy denial that would have been her only defense against any other man, but it died before it could be spoken. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this man, this quiet, watchful rancher, would not be fooled. His intelligence was a palpable force, something she had recognized in the sharp clarity of his blue eyes across a crowded saloon, and to insult that intelligence now would be a fatal mistake. So she stood silent, her breath caught in her throat, the smell of distant smoke a damning perfume, and waited for judgment. When she finally spoke, her voice was a low, strained whisper, stripped of its musicality and laid bare by the confrontation. "You wouldn't understand." It was a weak deflection, but it was all she could offer, a plea for him to turn back and forget what he had seen. Oliver did not move, his stillness a form of pressure that was more effective than any threat. He had caught a wolf, and he would not be turned aside by a wounded growl. "Try me," he responded, his voice still dangerously soft, yet carrying an unmistakable command. Cornered and with no other recourse, saw that the only path forward was through the truth, or at least a carefully curated version of it. She took a ragged breath and began to speak, the words tumbling out in a torrent of long-suppressed grief and fury. She told him of a smaller, greener valley from years ago, of a thriving ranch built by her father's own hands, and of the hope that had once lived there. She painted a picture of Jade Blackwood's arrival, not as the established baron he was now, but as a cunning predator with a charming smile and a heart full of avarice. He had systematically dismantled her father's life, using fraudulent claims, damming their water source under the guise of progress, and finally producing a signed deed that her father, a proud but uneducated man, swore he never would have approved. The fight had left her family destitute, her father a broken shell of the strong man he had once been. He had wasted away from the inside out, his spirit extinguished long before his body finally gave up. She omitted any mention of a brother, editing her history for this stranger in the dark, focusing only on the raw, personal wound that Blackwood had inflicted. She had come to Redemption Gulch not for money, she confessed, her voice thick with emotion, but for a different kind of currency, a reckoning. She intended to dismantle Blackwood's empire piece by piece, to make him feel the same slow, grinding despair that he had visited upon her family. Oliver listened to her story without interruption, his silhouette a study in patient contemplation as she poured out her poisoned past. The wind sighed through the trees around them, carrying the weight of her confession. When she finished, a heavy silence fell between them once more, but it was a different kind of silence, one filled with shared understanding rather than suspicion. Oliver had no love for Jade Blackwood. For years, he and the other small ranchers in the valley had been struggling under the man's thumb, watching as he illegally rerouted streams for his own vast herds and used his wealth to buy the law, slowly strangling their livelihoods. He saw the fire of justice in his quest, but he also recognized the incandescent rage that could get her killed. She was a single flame trying to burn down a fortress, and Blackwood was a man who crushed such threats without a second thought. Strange, protective instinct, mingled with the undeniable fascination she held for him, rose up within him. He couldn't let her face this alone. His decision was impulsive, a leap of faith for a man who always calculated his steps, but it felt profoundly right. "You can't stay at the saloon," he stated, the words an order, not a suggestion. "Blackwood or his men will figure it out sooner or later. My ranch is isolated. I need help, someone to cook and keep the house. The pay is steady." He saw her immediate, suspicious refusal forming and cut it off. It's a better cover than singing sad songs to drunkards, and it will keep you out of sight. From my land, you can see everything. You can watch him and you can plan, and I won't stop you." Reluctantly, agreed, recognizing the tactical advantage of his offer even as she bristled at the idea of being under his watch. The following days were a jarring transition, throwing the elegant, saloon singer into the relentlessly practical and often messy world of a working ranch. The initial grace she possessed on stage evaporated in the face of unfamiliar chores. She found herself locked in a silent, personal war with a flock of chickens that refused to surrender their eggs without a fight, and her first attempt at mending a fence resulted in a tangled mess of wire and a string of curses that made one of the ranch hands blush. Oliver, to his credit, was a patient teacher, a quiet and constant presence who showed her how to properly split wood, how to churn butter without splashing it all over the kitchen, and how to read the sky for signs of rain. His hands, calloused and strong, would often guide hers, a simple touch on her wrist to correct her grip on an axe handle, or a moment standing behind her to demonstrate the proper way to knead bread, sending an unexpected and entirely unwelcome jolt of awareness through her. In these moments, the sharp edges of their strange arrangement began to soften. A grudging respect grew between them, slowly blossoming into a comfortable camaraderie. Her sharp wit, once a defensive weapon, became a tool for playful banter, and his stoic silence was more frequently broken by a low chuckle at her city-bred helplessness. She brought a vibrant, chaotic energy to his quiet, orderly home, filling it with the scent of baking bread and the sound of her humming as she worked, and he, in turn, offered her a sanctuary, a place of surprising peace where the burning fire of her vengeance could cool to a more manageable, strategic heat. This evolving trust culminated one evening in his study, a Spartan room that smelled of old leather and wood smoke. Spread across his large oak desk was a detailed map of the entire valley, a document he had made himself over the years. With the rest of the ranch asleep, the two of them bent over the map, their heads closed together under the warm glow of an oil lamp, the dynamic between them having shifted from wary employer and employee to that of co-conspirators. Saw that her small, sporadic attacks were mere irritations to a man like Blackwood. Oliver, with his intimate knowledge of the cattle business, showed her how to land a truly damaging blow. He pointed to a narrow pass deep in the northern range, a critical on the trail to the railhead at. He had learned from his contacts that Blackwood was planning to move a massive herd, 500 head, his biggest sale of the year, in less than a week. A well-timed rock slide in that pass, something that looked entirely natural, would not only block the trail, but would force Blackwood's men on a 3-day detour through treacherous, waterless country. The delay would exhaust the cattle, causing them to lose significant weight and drastically lowering their market price, costing Blackwood not just a fortune, but also his reputation with the buyers. It was a bold, dangerous plan, and as they finalized the details, felt a thrill that was no longer just about revenge, but about the profound and electrifying connection she felt with the man standing beside her. Their alliance proved devastatingly effective. Oliver's knowledge of explosives, learned during a brief stint in the army, and his nerve in creating a diversion for the trail scouts, allowed them to execute the plan perfectly. The rockslide sealed the pass just hours before the herd arrived, and the news of Blackwood's disastrous sale became the talk of the territory. The victory, however, was short-lived. An enraged and humiliated Jade Blackwood returned to Redemption Gulch breathing fire. He was done dismissing these incidents as bad luck. He now knew he had an enemy, and he intended to unearth them. He stormed into the Last Chance saloon, no longer laughing or holding court, his face a mask of purple fury. He publicly announced that he was offering a staggering sum of money to anyone who could identify the saboteur. When that yielded nothing but nervous silence, he declared he was bringing in a professional. The next day, a new figure rode into town, a man who seemed to cast a cold shadow even under the bright afternoon sun. He was lean and wiry, dressed in dark, practical clothing, and he moved with the fluid, predatory grace of a panther. He dismounted in front of the saloon, his face impassive, his eyes taking in everything and revealing nothing. Gus, the saloon-keeper, whispered his name with a mixture of fear and awe. A bounty hunter with a fearsome reputation for being as relentless as he was brutally efficient, entered the saloon, his spurs ringing with a deathly quiet chime on the floorboards. His cold gaze swept across the room, dismissing the gamblers and drunkards before it came to rest, for one long, unnerving moment, directly on as she stood polishing glasses behind the bar, a brief visit to town that had suddenly turned perilous. The game had changed, and the stakes had just been raised to life and death. The arrival of cast a chilling pall over Redemption Gulch, a palpable sense of dread that seeped into the very dust of the streets. Unlike the boisterous, violent authority of Jade Blackwood and his men, the bounty hunter's power was a quiet, insidious thing, a creeping frost that silenced conversations and made men look over their shoulders. He did not swagger or threaten. Instead, he moved through the town with a methodical patience that was far more terrifying. He would sit in the saloon for hours, nursing a single beer, his eyes missing nothing, his presence a silent judgment on all he surveyed. The net he cast was not one of force, but of information. He spoke to everyone, from the stable boy to the blacksmith, his questions disarmingly simple, his tone mild, yet he possessed an unnerving ability to peel back layers of deception with a single, well-aimed query. For an Oliver, the world shrank to the confines of the ranch, each trip to town for supplies becoming a nerve-shredding ordeal. The constant, gnawing fear of discovery became their shadow, a third party in their dangerous alliance. They communicated in coded phrases and furtive glances, the secret that bound them together now feeling like a heavy chain, withholding the other end, slowly, inexorably pulling it taut. The pressure forced them into an even deeper intimacy, their shared secret creating an isolated world where they were the only two inhabitants who truly understood the stakes. This new, suffocating reality was a crucible that forged their connection into something stronger and more desperate than either of them had anticipated. The lighthearted moments of her disastrous ranching lessons were gone, replaced by a raw, unspoken understanding that grew in the charged silence of the long evenings. They found themselves seeking each other out, not for strategy sessions, but for the simple, profound comfort of not being alone. Oliver would find her staring out at the distant lights of Blackwood's property, her expression a mixture of hatred and fear, and he would stand beside her, not speaking, but offering his solid presence as an anchor in the storm of her emotions. She, in turn, began to see past his stoic, self-reliant exterior, recognizing the deep well of loyalty and honor that guided him. She saw the way he cared for his men and his animals, the quiet integrity that had led him to risk everything for a cause that was not his own. The danger they faced stripped away all pretense, leaving only a visceral, undeniable attraction that pulsed between them, a dangerous spark in a world filled with gunpowder. It was a bond forged in fear, but it felt more real and more powerful than anything had ever known. The breaking point came on a night when a fierce wind howled down from the mountains, rattling the windows of the barn and sounding like the mournful cries of ghosts. Oliver found there, huddled in the hayloft, her arms wrapped around herself, her composure finally shattered. The relentless pressure, the constant looking over her shoulder, and the terrifying image of cold, assessing eyes had worn her down to a nub. For the first time since she had arrived in Redemption Gulch, she looked not like a vengeful angel or a cunning saboteur, but like a terrified young woman who was in far over her head. The sight of her vulnerability pierced Oliver's heart. He moved to her side, sitting so close their shoulders touched, the scent of hay and her cherry-scented soap filling the small space. He took her trembling hand in his grip firm and reassuring. "I'm not in this just to see Blackwood fall anymore," he said, his voice a low, earnest rumble that was nearly lost in the wail of the wind. "I'm in this for you. I won't let anything happen to you." It was a simple, profound declaration, a promise that went far beyond their shared mission. Looked up at him, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and saw not just an ally, but a protector, a man who was willing to stand between her and the abyss. The vengeance that had fueled her for so long suddenly seemed secondary to the overwhelming, terrifying, and beautiful emotion that was flooding her heart. Leaning in, she closed the small distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was not about passion or lust, but about a desperate, grateful, and soul-deep connection. It was a moment of pure, honest truth, a fragile fortress against the storm raging both outside and within. Meanwhile, continued his methodical work, but his investigation had taken an unexpected turn. while Blackwood assumed he was hunting a common saboteur, was digging into the past, unearthing the very roots of Blackwood's empire. He spent hours in the dusty, neglected town records office, poring over brittle property deeds and faded ledgers, his focus not on recent events, but on the transactions of a decade prior. He was a patient archaeologist of grievances, brushing away the dust of years to reveal the original crime. He then began to seek out the old-timers, the men with long memories who sat on porches and watched the world go by. He didn't ask them about cut fences or spooked horses. He bought them drinks and asked them about the old Miller Ranch, the one Blackwood now owned. He asked about the family, about the patriarch who had died of a broken heart, and more specifically, he asked about the son, a hot-headed young man who had reportedly vanished after a brutal fight with some of Blackwood's men, a boy that most of the town had long since forgotten, presuming him dead or simply gone for good. Listened to their rambling stories with an unnerving stillness, his mind piecing together a puzzle that only he could see. The final piece of that puzzle was Oliver. Had observed the man, had noted his quiet competence, his fierce independence, and the protective way he watched over his new housekeeper. He understood that Oliver was the variable, the unforeseen element that had both protected and complicated plans. He chose his moment carefully, confronting Oliver not at the ranch, but on a remote stretch of rangeland miles from any prying eyes. Oliver was checking a line cabin when the bounty hunter seemed to materialize from the whispering aspens, moving with a silence that was deeply unsettling. Oliver's hand went instinctively to the Colt at his hip, but made no threatening move. "Your fence-mending cook is going to get herself killed," said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Blackwood is bringing in hired guns, not just investigators. The game is over." Oliver's eyes narrowed, his posture hostile. "Stay away from her." A flicker of something that might have been grim amusement crossed his face. "I have no intention of harming her," he said, and then he delivered the blow that changed everything. "She's my sister." He let the words hang in the still mountain air, watching as disbelief, confusion, and finally dawning understanding washed over Oliver's face. He then recounted his own story, a tale of survival against impossible odds. He hadn't fled after the beating from Blackwood's men. He had been left for dead in a ravine, found and nursed back to health by a traveling trapper. For 10 years, he had lived under a different name, honing his skills, building a fearsome reputation as a bounty hunter, all with the singular, ice-cold goal of one day returning to destroy the man who had stolen his family's legacy and murdered his father as surely as if he'd used a gun. He had taken Blackwood's job to control the investigation from the inside. To protect the sister he was stunned to find waging her own war, and to finally get close enough to strike the killing blow. He had been cleaning up's trail, subtly misdirecting Blackwood's suspicion, but her recklessness, coupled with Oliver's intervention, had accelerated the timeline. They were out of time for small acts of sabotage. "There's a ledger," said, his voice dropping to an intense whisper, his eyes burning with a decade of cold fury. "I've confirmed it. A hidden ledger in a safe in Blackwood's office. It details everything, the bribes, the illegal water deals, the fraudulent deed to my father's ranch. It's the key to his complete destruction." He explained that Blackwood, spooked and bleeding money, was planning to move his entire operation to a new territory within the week, and the ledger would go with him, disappearing forever. They had one chance one night to get it. The bounty hunter, the rancher, and the vengeful sister now had to unite for a single, desperate gamble. "I can get inside," stated, looking directly at Oliver, acknowledging him as a partner. "But I can't do it alone." "The question is, are you in?" The air in Oliver's barn was thick with the scent of hay and nervous tension, a stark contrast to the cold, clear strategy being laid out under the singular, unwavering light of a hanging lantern. The three of them, the vengeful daughter, the long-lost son, and the steadfast rancher who had become the unlikely linchpin of their desperate plot, formed a tight, focused circle, their faces etched with the gravity of the single night that lay before them. His voice, a low and steady murmur that cut through the silence, detailed the layout of Blackwood's office and the mechanics of the safe with a chilling expertise that left no doubt of his capabilities. The plan they forged was one of beautiful, dangerous precision, a three-pronged assault that relied on perfect timing and unwavering nerve. Oliver, with his knowledge of the land and explosives, would be the catalyst for chaos. His task was to create a significant and believable diversion at the far end of Blackwood's property, a raging grass fire that would threaten a winter-pastured herd and draw away the bulk of Blackwood's men, including, they hoped, the man himself. For her final performance, was tasked with the most delicate and perilous role. She would return to the Last Chance Saloon, her cherry lipstick a painted shield, and use her proximity to a drunken, distracted Blackwood to lift the key to his office from his waistcoat, a piece of brazen thievery that had to be executed flawlessly under the gaze of the entire town. The ghost of their operation would use the ensuing chaos to slip through the town, his skills allowing him to handle the infiltration and the complex mechanisms of the safe, the final barrier between them and the justice they so desperately sought. As dusk bled across the sky, painting the horizon in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, their plan was set into motion, each actor moving to their designated stage. Miles away, Oliver's diversion erupted into a terrifying spectacle of light and sound, the fire racing across the dry grassland with a speed that sent a genuine wave of panic through Blackwood's distant ranch hands. From the porch of the saloon, the glow was an angry orange stain against the encroaching darkness, and it worked even better than they had anticipated, pulling not only Blackwood's men, but the man himself out into the street, his face a mask of fury as he bellowed orders and rode off toward the blaze. Inside the saloon began her performance, her voice weaving a spell of melancholy over the remaining patrons, but her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her true performance was for Blackwood's right-hand man, a sycophant named Finch who had been left behind. Feigning a dizzy spell after her song, she stumbled against him, her hand moving with the practiced grace of a pickpocket as she steadied herself, her fingers deftly closing around the cold, heavy brass key in his pocket. The exchange took less than a second. With the key pressed into her palm, she excused herself, her face a mask of feigned illness, and slipped out the back door into the alley where waited like a phantom. Together, they moved through the darkened back ways of the town, two shadows united by a single purpose, the sounds of the saloon fading behind them as they approached the silent, imposing structure of Blackwood's office. The suspense inside the office was a suffocating, tangible thing, the air thick with the scent of expensive cigar smoke and old paper. While stood guard by the door, her ears straining for any sound of approach, knelt before the massive iron safe, his touch as delicate as a surgeon. The only sounds in the room were the frantic ticking of a grandfather clock and the whisper-soft clicks of the tumblers as manipulated the dial, his entire being focused on the intricate conversation between his fingers and the lock. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The distant shouts from the fire seemed to be fading, a worrying sign that the diversion was losing its power. Just as a fresh wave of panic began to crest within, a final, solid thunk echoed in the room. The heavy door swung open, revealing the dark leather-bound ledger nestled within. Triumph, fierce and bright, surged through, but as reached inside and pulled the book free, the office door swung inward, crashing against the wall. Framed in the doorway stood Jade Blackwood, his face contorted in a triumphant sneer, flanked by two of his largest, most brutal guards. He had not been as distracted as they'd hoped. A sliver of paranoia, a nagging doubt about the singer's sudden illness had brought him back from the fire early. "Looking for this," he snarled, his eyes gleaming with malice as he took in the scene, the open safe, the ledger in his hand, and the terrified, defiant look on his face. The standoff was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Blackwood's men raised their pistols, the muzzles like dark, hollow eyes in the lamplight. It was over, the trap had snapped shut. But just as Blackwood took a step forward, savoring his victory, a new figure filled the doorway behind him. It was Oliver, his face grim, his duster coated in ash, a shotgun held loosely but purposefully in his hands. He had seen Blackwood ride back toward town, and trusting his gut, had circled around, his return a silent prayer answered. The ensuing struggle was not a prolonged battle, but a short, brutal explosion of violence. Oliver's shotgun blast tore into the ceiling, the deafening roar and shower of plaster providing the split second of distraction needed. The bounty hunter moved with blinding speed, a knife appearing in his hand as he disarmed one guard while Oliver used the heavy shotgun as a club, a devastating arc that sent the second guard crashing to the floor. The fight was a whirlwind of desperate, close-quarters combat, a dance of survival where Oliver's raw strength and lethal precision worked in perfect, deadly harmony. Blackwood, stunned by the sudden reversal, found himself staring down the barrel of Oliver's Colt, his reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with the quiet, final click of a hammer being cocked. Months later, a profound and lasting peace had settled over the valley, the kind that comes after a long and brutal fever has finally broken. With Blackwood's ledger in the hands of a visiting U.S. Marshal, his corrupt empire had been systematically dismantled, his name now a whispered curse rather than a feared authority. The town of Redemption Gulch, free from his shadow, was beginning to find its own, more honest rhythm. The land itself seemed to breathe easier, the water running clear in the streams that Blackwood had once hoarded for himself. On a hill overlooking the valley, the old Miller Ranch was slowly coming back to life, the sounds of hammers and saws a joyful song of resurrection under the stewardship of, who had reclaimed not just his land but his name. Oliver rode up to the ranch one late afternoon, the setting sun casting long, gentle shadows across the porch. Was there, waiting for him, leaning against a newly painted rail. She wore a simple cotton dress, her curly brown hair unbound and falling freely around her shoulders, and as she smiled at his approach, he noticed that her lips, for the first time since he had met her, were bare. The vibrant, defiant armor of the cherry lipstick was gone, replaced by a natural, peaceful confidence that was infinitely more beautiful. He dismounted and walked up the steps, not saying a word, his heart full. He pulled her into his arms, and the kiss they shared was not one of desperation or fear, but one of quiet promise and deep, abiding love, a kiss that tasted of clean air and a hopeful future. They stood together on the porch, his arm around her, looking out at the land that was finally, rightfully hers, the man who once smelled of whiskey and the woman who once wore cherry lipstick having found their way home.